Chapter 4. Did Jesus match the identity of the Messiah? I've written a lot of articles over the years on predictions about the future. It's one of those New Year's stories that all beginning reporters get stuck doing. And I know how few predictions actually come true. For instance, every year people in Chicago insist that the Cubs are going to clinch the World Series, and that certainly hasn't come true in my lifetime. In the Jewish scriptures, which Christians call the Old Testament, there are several dozen major prophecies about the coming of the Messiah, who would be sent by God to redeem his people. These predictions provide a way for the Israelites to rule out any imposters and check the credentials of the authentic Messiah. The Greek word for Messiah is Christ. But was Jesus really the Christ? Did he fulfill these predictions that were written hundreds of years before he was born? A nice Jewish boy from New Jersey. For an insider's look at the Old Testament prophecies, I decided to talk with Louis Lapidus. He grew up in a Jewish family in Newark, New Jersey. For someone with his heritage, the question of whether Jesus is the long-anticipated Messiah goes beyond theory. It's an intensely personal matter. I wanted to hear about his investigation of this issue. Looking for a religion that works. My parents got divorced when I was 17, Lapidus told me, and even after all these years, I could still hear the hurt in his voice. That's when I gave up whatever faith I had. I wondered, where does God come in? Why didn't they go to a rabbi for counseling? What good is religion if it can't help people in a practical way? It sure couldn't keep my parents together. When they split up, part of me split up as well. Does God relate to my struggles? Does he care about me as an individual? On top of that, in Judaism, I didn't feel as if I had a personal relationship with God. I had a lot of beautiful ceremonies and traditions, but our God was a distant God who said, "Here are the rules. You live by them, you'll be okay. I'll see you later." And there I was, an adolescent with raging hormones, wondering, does God relate to my problems? Does he care about me as an individual? Well, not in any way I could see. Not after long after his parents' divorce, Lapidus was drafted. By 1967, he found himself on the other side of the world in a cargo boat whose freight, ammunition, bombs, rockets, and other high explosives, made it a tempting target for the Viet Cong. Lapidus recalled, "In our orientation in Vietnam, they told us 20% of you will probably get killed, and the other 80% of you will probably get a sexually transmitted disease, or become alcoholics, or get hooked on drugs." I thought, I don't even have a 1% chance of coming out normal? He survived Vietnam, returning home with a taste for marijuana and an interest in Eastern religions. "I went to Buddhist meetings, but that was empty," he said. "I went to Scientology meetings, but they were too manipulative and controlling. Hinduism believed in gods who would have all these crazy orgies and in gods who were blue elephants. None of it made sense. None of it was satisfying. I can't believe in Jesus." One religion Lapidus refused to consider was Christianity. Whenever anyone would bring up the name of Jesus, Lapidus would fend him off with his stock answer. "I'm Jewish," he would say. "I can't believe in Jesus." Then one day, a pastor challenged him. "Do you know of the prophecies about the Messiah?" he asked. Lapidus was taken off guard. "Prophecies?" he said. "I've never heard of them." The minister startled Lapidus by referring to some of the Old Testament predictions. Wait a minute, Lapidus thought. Those are my Jewish scriptures he's quoting. How could Jesus be in there? When the pastor offered him a Bible, Lapidus was skeptical. "Is the New Testament in there?" he asked. The pastor nodded. "Okay, I'll read the Old Testament, but I'm not going to open the other one," Lapidus told him. He was surprised by the minister's response. "Fine," said the pastor. "Just read the Old Testament and ask the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the God of Israel, to show you if Jesus is the Messiah. Because he is your Messiah. He came to the Jewish people first, and then he also became the Savior of the world." To Lapidus, this was new information. Intriguing information. Astonishing information. So he went back to his apartment, opened the Old Testament to its first book, Genesis, and went hunting for Jesus among the words that had been written hundreds of years before the carpenter of Nazareth had been born. A portrait of Jesus. Pretty soon, Lapidus told me, I was reading the Old Testament every day and finding one prophecy after another. As Lapides worked through the scriptures, he was stopped cold by Isaiah 53. C box, predictions of the Messiah. Here was the picture of a Messiah who would suffer and die for the sins of Israel and the world, all written more than 700 years before Jesus walked the earth. Instantly, Lapides recognized the portrait. This was Jesus of Nazareth. Jews in the Old Testament tried to pay for their sins through a system of animal sacrifices. Here was Jesus, the ultimate sacrifice, who paid for sin once and for all. Here was the personification of God's plan of redemption. This discovery was so amazing that Lapides could come to only one conclusion. It was a fraud. He believed that Christians had rewritten the Old Testament and twisted Isaiah's word to make it sound as if the prophet had been foreshadowing Jesus. And if it was just a hoax, then Lapides wanted to expose it. I asked my stepmother to send me a Jewish Bible so I could check it out myself, he told me. She did, and guess what? It said the same thing. Now I really had to deal with it. Becoming whole. Lapides and some friends headed into a Mojave desert for a getaway. Spiritually, he was feeling conflicted. He had nightmares of being torn apart by dogs pulling at him from opposite directions. Sitting amongst the desert scrub, he remembered what someone once told him. You're either on God's side or on Satan's side. Predictions of the Messiah. He was despised and rejected by men, a man of sorrows and familiar with suffering. Like one from whom men hide their faces, he was despised, and we esteemed him not. Surely he took up our infirmities and carried our sorrows. Yet we considered him stricken by God, smitten by him and afflicted. But he was pierced for our transgressions, he was crushed for our iniquities. The punishment that brought us peace was upon him, and by his wounds we are healed. We all, like sheep, have gone astray. Each one of us has turned to his own way, and the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. He was oppressed and afflicted, yet he did not open his mouth. He was led like a lamb to the slaughter, and as the sheep before her shearers is silent, so he did not open his mouth. By oppression and judgment he was taken away, and who can speak of his descendants? For he was cut off from the land of the living. For the transgression of my people he was stricken. He was assigned a grave with the wicked, and with the rich in his death, though he had done no violence, nor was any deceit in his mouth. For he bore the sin of many, and made intercession for his transgressors. Isaiah chapter 53, verses 3-9 and 12. After all he had seen in Vietnam, he knew about evil, and that's not the side he wanted to be on. So Lapides prayed, God, I've got to come to the end of this struggle. I have to know beyond the shadow of doubt that Jesus is the Messiah. I need to know that you, as the God of Israel, want me to believe this. As he told me the story, Lapides hesitated, unsure how to put into words what happened next. The best way I can describe what happened is that God spoke to my heart. He convinced me that he exists. And out in the desert, in my heart, I said, God, I accept Jesus into my life. I don't understand what I'm supposed to do with him, but I want him. I've pretty much made a mess of my life. I need you to change me. And Lapides said, God began to do this in a process that continues to this day. My friends knew my life had changed, and they couldn't understand it, he said. They'd say, something happened to you in the desert. You don't want to do drugs anymore. There's something different about you. I would say, well, I can't explain it either. All I know is there's someone in my life, and it's someone who's holy, who's righteous, and I just feel whole. That last word, it seemed, said everything. Whole, he emphasized to me, in a way I had never felt before. Probing the prophecies. When I read Isaiah 53 in the Old Testament, like Lapides, I found it to be an uncanny description of Jesus being crucified. And yet, it was written more than 700 years before the fact. That's like my trying to predict how the Cubs will do in the year 2700. In all, there are about 6 major prophecies concerning the Messiah, and the more I studied them, the more difficulty I had trying to explain them away. Messianic maneuvering? My first line of defense was that Jesus may have intentionally maneuvered his life to fulfill the prophecy so that he would be mistaken for the Messiah. For instance, Zechariah 9:9 predicted that the Messiah would ride a donkey into Jerusalem. Maybe when Jesus was getting ready to enter the town, he told his disciples, "Go fetch me a donkey. I want to fool these people into thinking I'm the Messiah. After all, I'm anxious to get tortured to death." But that argument fell apart when I read prophecies about events that Jesus never could have arranged, such as the place of his birth, which the prophet Micah had predicted hundreds of years in advance, his family tree, how he was betrayed for a specific amount of money, how he was put to death, how his bones remained unbroken, unlike the two criminals who were crucified with him, how the soldiers cast lots for his clothing, and on and on. See box. Coincidence? My second line of defense was that Jesus might have fulfilled these prophecies by coincidence. Maybe several people in history have fit these predictions, but Jesus happened to have a better public relations agent, and so now he's the one everyone remembers. But reading a book by Dr. Peter Stoner, a science professor, undermined that objection. Stoner worked with 600 students to come up with their best estimate of the mathematical probability of just 8 Old Testament prophecies being fulfilled in any one person living down to the present time. Stoner then calculated that the probability of anyone fulfilling all 8 would be 1 chance in 100 million billion. That's a figure with 17 zeros behind it. Could Jesus have arranged his prophecies? Life to fulfill these prophecies. Prophecies, Jesus' life. Place of birth. But you, Bethlehem, Ephrathah, though you are small among the clans of Judah, out of you will come for me one who will be ruler over Israel, whose origins are from old, from ancient times. Micah 5:2. Jesus was born in Bethlehem. See Matthew chapter 2, verse 1. Family tree. A new day is coming, announces the Lord. At that time, I will raise up from David's royal line a true and rightful branch, and the branch will be called the Lord who makes us right with himself. Jeremiah chapter 22, verses 5 and 6, NIRV. Jesus was a descendant of David. Blood money. I told them, if you think it best, give me my pay, but if not, keep it. So they paid me 30 pieces of silver, and the Lord said to me, throw it to the potter, the handsome price at which they priced me. So I took the 30 pieces of silver and threw them into the house of the Lord to the potter. Zechariah chapter 11, verses 12 to 13. Judas Iscariot betrayed Jesus for 30 silver coins. Later, Judas threw the money into the temple and left, and the priest decided to use the money to buy a potter's field. Matthew chapter 26, verses 15, 27, verse 5 and 7. Gambling over clothes. They divide my garments among them and cast lots for my clothing. Psalm 22:18. While Jesus was being crucified, soldiers gambled for his clothes by casting lots. See Matthew 27:35. Want a more human, less mathematical picture of these odds? Imagine the entire world covered with white tile that is 1.5 inches square. Every bit of dry land on the planet with a gold star painted on the bottom of just one of those tiles. Then picture a person be allowed to wander for a lifetime around all 7 continents. He would be permitted to bend down only one time and pick up a single piece of tile. What are the odds it would be the one tile with a gold star on its reverse side? 1 chance in 100 million billion. The same as just 8 of the Old Testament prophecies coming true in any one person throughout history. Now, you can agree or disagree with the estimates that the students came up with for Stoner's calculations. After all, prophecies can be difficult to quantify and assessments can vary. You could come up with your own estimates and do your own calculations, but when I examined the prophecies myself, I had to agree with Stoner's conclusion. The chances of anyone coincidentally fulfilling these ancient predictions would surely be prohibitive. A worthwhile investment? Jesus said he came to fulfill the prophecies. He said, everything must be fulfilled that is written about me in the law of Moses, the prophets, and the Psalms. Luke 24:44. I was beginning to believe that they really were fulfilled, only in Jesus Christ. I imagined being offered a business deal with just 1 chance in 100 million billion that I'd lose. I'd put everything I owned into a surefire winner like that. And I was starting to think, with odds like that, maybe I should think about investing my life in Christ. But just as I wouldn't invest in a stock without making sure the source of information was reliable, I wouldn't invest my time in Jesus without checking out the reliability of the information on him. The New Testament. Living and forgiving like God. Does Jesus match the description of God? The Old Testament gives details about the God of the Bible that sketch out very specifically what he's like. Now Jesus claims to be God, but does he match the sketch of God that we can find elsewhere in the Bible? If he doesn't, we can conclude that his claims to being God is false. Two important qualities of God have to do with sin. God himself is sinless, and God can forgive sins. How does Jesus match up? God. Jesus. God can forgive sins. According to the Bible, God is the one in charge of forgiving sin. When King David committed adultery and then arranged the death of the woman's husband, he said to God, "Against you, you only have I sinned." Psalm 51:4. David recognized that although he had hurt people, in the end he had sinned against God and he needed God to forgive him. Jesus offered forgiveness for sins. One of the most striking and offensive to many people things that Jesus did was to forgive sin. You can read one account in Mark chapter 2 verses 1 to 12. Think about it. If you do something against me, I have the right to forgive you. But if you do something against me and somebody else comes along and says, "I forgive you," what kind of arrogance is that? The only person who could have the right would be God. God is morally perfect and holy. The Old Testament prophet Isaiah made the contrast between people, sinful, and God, sinless, pretty clear. See Isaiah 5:15-16 for an example. Right after that, things got personal for Isaiah when he encountered God in a vision. While heavenly creatures were shouting, "Holy, holy, holy," about God, Isaiah was crying, "I'm doomed. Everything I say is sinful, and so are the words of everyone around me." Isaiah 6:3-5, CEV. Jesus claimed to be morally perfect and holy. Not only did Jesus forgive sin, he claimed to be sinless himself. Jesus said, with a straight face, "Can any of you prove me guilty of sin?" John 8:46. If I said that, my friends and family and everybody who knows me would be glad to stand up and testify. But it seems that the better people got to know Jesus, the more they marveled at his integrity. Two of his closest companions, John and Peter, wrote, "In him is no sin." 1 John 3:5. And he didn't commit any sin. No lies ever came out of his mouth. 1 Peter 2:22, NIRV.